Who killed Boris Nemtsov? Tens of thousands turning out Sunday in Moscow and elsewhere to pay tribute to the one-time heir, say some, to Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s. Nemtsov may have since become one of the current president's most vocal critics, but with Vladimir Putin's popularity well north of 80%, any opposition in today's Russia can seem relative. What impact will this murder have? We'll be looking at the latest in a shooting death that happened just across from the Kremlin, in one of the capital's safest neighborhoods, and put it in the context of a growing list of high-profile political assassinations in Russia. Today in the France 24 debate, the murder of Boris Nemtsov. And joining us, journalist Andrei Grachev, former spokesperson for Mikhail Gorbachev, who joins us here in the studio. Thank you for being back with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us from Moscow, social activist and e-business consultant Alyona Popova. Here in the studio, we're also joined by reporter and documentary filmmaker Anne Nivat and by Michel Gravard of the Russian Forum in France. Thank you for joining us. France 24's Douglas Herbert, who in a previous life in the 1990s worked at the Moscow Bureau of the New York Times. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag F24debate. Boris Nemtsov burst onto the scene at the ripe old age of 31. He was named governor of Novy Novgorod region. It was 1991, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nemtsov's destiny, like that of Russia, could have taken a far different turn. Sanam Chantier has the story.
He was by far the most prominent opposition figure under Vladimir Putin's 15-year rule. Boris Nemtsov was also a scientist and a father of four. The slain 55-year-old launched his political career as a governor in central Russia. His charisma, contacts and drive shot him up through the ranks. In the late 1990s, Nemtsov became a deputy prime minister under the country's first elected president, soon gaining a reputation as a leading liberal reformer. At one point, he was even seen as a possible successor to Boris Yeltsin. After leaving parliament in 2003, he helped establish several opposition parties. With that came his booming speeches and vocal opposition to Putin.
We need political reform. When power is in the hands of one person and this person rules forever, this will lead to an absolute catastrophe. The current crisis is man-made.
The opposition leader routinely slammed the government's inefficiency and rampant corruption. And his criticism won him support amongst Moscow's emerging middle classes and intellectuals. Prior to his assassination, Nemtsov was working on a report that he believed proved Russia's direct involvement in the incursion into Ukraine, a war that he staunchly opposed.
We say no to war. We say enough of this idiocy. We say we want Russia and Ukraine without Putin. Russia and Ukraine without Putin.
Nemtsov had been quoted as saying he was concerned that the president might want him dead over his opposition to the conflict in Ukraine. But despite his imprisonment, defiant he remained.
They wanted to frighten me. They wanted to put me under pressure, because putting a person in a stone cell for 40 hours during the New Year's celebration is a threatening act. But they neither managed to frighten me nor put pressure on me. As a matter of fact, I'm now ready for a fight.
A fight that ended in his brutal assassination. Although Nemtsov was no longer considered part of mainstream politics in Russia, news of his killing in the late hours of Friday sent shockwaves across the country.
We'll be talking more about those shockwaves. Let me first turn to you, Andrei Grachev. Do you recall when you first heard of Boris Nemtsov and when you saw this rise? He was one of the young stars rising to be deputy prime minister under Yeltsin.
Yeah, that's right. And he was one of the brightest representatives of what I would call the perestroika generation, because he was first, I think, noticed in the circle surrounding Boris Yeltsin after already the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think he was probably one of the, maybe the youngest governor of a very important region, Nizhny Novgorod. And, well, he produced a very impressive image already at that time. And I remember at a certain moment, Boris Yeltsin did not hesitate to show Tony Blair, who was on a visit in Nizhny Novgorod, to him as his potential heir, because apparently he liked the man very much. So,
And did you take Yeltsin seriously when he said that?
well, who knows? You know, unfortunately, Boris, neither of the two are there to ask them.
And Nivat, how do you remember Boris Nemtsov?
Well, he was a very good friend of mine because I lived for 10 years in Russia as a correspondent. And of course, I had to go to interview him to try to understand how this new opposition, these new leaders who became in the opposition, like Boris Nemtsov, were functioning. And he was always open-minded, very charismatic. He's very charismatic. He was a very charismatic young guy and leader. But to say the truth, of course, in the last years, he had to reinvent himself as an opponent to Putin. And because new leaders of the opposition had appeared, such as Alexei Navalny, for example, 17 years younger than him. But despite that, he was still in the air. He was still at the center of the events. He was still at the center of the opposition in Moscow. And he was supposed to lead the demonstration that should have taken place yesterday if he hadn't been killed dead the day before.
Douglas Herbert, Boris Nemtsov, opposition leader who we saw in that report, braving the cold with not many people there in front of him, how does that mesh with the Boris Nemtsov that you covered as a Kremlin insider?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, we were just hearing Anne say, it was a reinvention, really. I mean, we saw the flip side of Boris Nemtsov in the 2000s that we saw in the 90s, late 80s when he was rising. I mean, he was a man in the establishment. He was, yes, a crusading reformer, young and charismatic, and seen as someone. Remember, with the region in which he was governor, Nizhny Novgorod, it wasn't just any region. It was sort of called the laboratory of reform. It was a place where he was almost testing the new types of policies. There was a lot of hope back then. Yes, Yeltsin's Russia was a place of chaos and disorder, but you didn't have the deep, deep cynicism yet that has set in, that would set in subsequent years, especially in more recent years under Vladimir Putin. You still had the sense that there was a possibility that things could change for the better, and Nemtsov was seen as sort of a beacon of that possibility at the time. So it must have been, I can only imagine, psychologically, emotionally for him, it must have been quite a shock and a transition to go from, like you said, right in the nexus of power, going from being a vice prime minister under Yeltsin to all of a sudden having to reinvent himself, having to form not just one, but multiple opposition parties, because it was constantly changing, the opposition, very fragmented, very divided. He had to constantly sort of come up with new ideas to remain relevant in the opposition. That's the story of the opposition today. A couple of years back, when I asked Garry Kasparov this question during an interview, I said, well, how would you define the opposition, the state of the opposition in Russia today? And they were partners, Kasparov and Nemtsov. Garry Kasparov said to me, he says, what opposition? There is no opposition in Russia. No such thing as opposition party.
Alyona Popova, how will you remember Boris Nemtsov?
He wasn't my friend, but he is an honest man. And when Amon broke my arm, it was 2 years ago, so he was first who helped me. He called me during these protest actions with the question, how can I help you? And he knows that we need a women leader in Russia, so he was assured that he could do it with the help of us, like young women who are gathering together against all this crazy situation in Russia. And for me, it was really shocked because before his death, 3 hours before his death, I was in Yaroslavl. I was like a public person who was speaking with the parliamentaries over there and the governor, and it was presented the new strategy of how we can develop an entrepreneurship in Yaroslavl. And one young man from the audience asked me, what do you think about Boris Nemtsov? And I answered like, he's not my friend, but I really admire him. Like, I think that he is a really charismatic person, and many people around me thinks that he can be like a president or a vice president because many people believes in him. And after 3 hours, my friend called me with, he is dead, and I was shocked.
And Aliona Popova, when you hear Douglas Herbert and Anivat talk about how, he's been already, even though he was 55, superseded by a younger generation, how did he seem to take it?
Can you repeat the question, please?
He seemed to be superseded by the generation of Alexei Navalny. How did he seem to take it, Boris Nemtsov?
In my generation, he is not a star, but he is previous leaders, and we all believe that his great experience, and we can use it in our, deals, in our ideological things, and how can we change this world, how can we change Russia at all. And we all think that he's one of us. It's really interesting things, because we don't think that people from 90s are our friends, like us. But we all think that Boris Nemtsov was one of us. And nobody thinks that he is not the person who should represent it in a wall of new leaders of Russia. No, he is one of us. He was one of us.
Michel Grabar?
So, first of all, I wanted to say that he was a nice person and a very courageous person. Of course, I don't share his point of view now, but I admire the person he was in the 90s. He was a very active young man. He was appreciated by President Yeltsin and also by all the women in Russia. He was very popular among women. That's right. He's very charismatic, and for me it was a shock. Of course, his assassination is a terrible shock, and I wanted just to stress that before going into details. And we are everybody, my generation. I'm almost 50. He was 55. We are the same generation. And we wanted a new Russia after communism, and he was a symbol of this new Russia.
What's striking in this conversation, Andrei Grachev, is that there is this sense now that there's this wave of cynicism that's slowly overcoming Russia.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe from this point of view, Boris Nemtsov was maybe an exceptional figure, because he managed something that practically no one else realized. In fact, he had been a political leader at the time of Yeltsin. Now, for many, remembering those times is remembering the times of chaos, of the beginning of the corruption and of the compromising of the democracy and market economy, the way it was presented there. Nemtsov succeeded in something exceptional. He could reinvent himself as a leader of the opposition, and to a certain extent, from my point of view, he brought back the credit to himself, to his past, because it is in this way that he was confirming that he was sincere even in those times. And maybe I think that his sincerity, his integrity could be saved precisely by the fact that he was not in Moscow. He was rather far from Kremlin and the close circle around Yeltsin. He was in Nizhny Novgorod, and there, as you are saying, he was trying to realize something in what he was believing. And I think his action as a protest leader was a proof of the fact that he was feeling inalienation with the way Russia was developing in the last years under Putin.
There was many death threats, as we saw in that report at the outset. Were you surprised, shocked that he was killed, in fact?
I think that every political assassination is a surprise. Certainly, he must have thought that, in a way, he was kind of covered by his popularity, but this is certainly the illusion of many victims of this kind of assassinations. At the same time, I think it's a very sad, I would say, proof of the fact that being a political professional in present Russia, of Vladimir Putin, is a risky business. It's a mortal threat, and unfortunately, Nemtsov is not the first on the list, and I'm afraid not the last.
It brings us to the central question of whodunit. Police combing over grainy closed-circuit TV footage, searching for a man, 1.70 meters tall, who, after walking up behind Nemtsov and shooting him 4 times in the back with an old pistol, reportedly using several types of bullets, then fled aboard a getaway car, a car that was later found. There's a bounty out, 3 million rubles, that's roughly $48,000, for information in finding the killer, who, according to investigators, could well have been part of a plot, they say, to discredit the Kremlin. Other theories bandied about: jihadists upset at Nemtsov's support for Charlie Hebdo after the January terror attacks in Paris, and extremists over Ukraine.
We are already checking a line of inquiry linked to events in Ukraine. It's no secret that on both sides there are very radical individuals not controlled by any authorities. Of course, we aren't excluding other versions linked to Mr. Nemtsov's business activities, personal dislike, or other domestic reasons.
Alyona Popova, whodunit?
I don't know, but I don't believe in domestic version. Like somebody hates him and try to kill him. No, because he's a public person and it was near Kremlin. And for me, it's impossible that somebody can kill him with such kind of operation. Somebody knows the exact time when he was in the center of this breach. Somebody knows his way, the whole way. And somebody knows that the cameras nearby won't work. So, for me, it's shock. I don't feel that we can be safe in the center of Moscow. So I'm sure that it's not a domestic version.
Right.
It's a version of, right. It's about the ideological thing, that somebody can kill him with use of these types of knowledge about cameras, the way, about his lady who was nearby. So it's not the regular thing, and I'm totally think that this is a professional guy. He was a professional guy.
It was a professional guy, Courtney. We're going to put it to the rest of the panel when we come back. I want to thank Andrei Grachev, because I know you're expected on our French language set. But thank you for joining us. I'm going to put it to the rest of the panel when we come back. Who murdered Boris Nemtsov? You're watching the France 24 debate.